You're watching Daily Story 68, where the raw, untold truths of love, lies, and betrayal unfold before your eyes. Every story you see here is more than just a tale. It's a journey of emotions, choices, and the painful consequences that follow. If you're finding these stories as gripping and intense as I do, don't just passively watch. Take a moment to hit that like button. Your support means the world and helps these stories reach others who need to hear them. Now let's dive into today's heart-wrenching tale. I never imagined I'd be the kind of woman who would hide things from her husband. You know how these stories always begin, right? The person narrating insists they never thought they'd be that way. The one with secrets and lies. But if I'm being honest, I didn't think I was that type of person either. I believed with every part of me in the power of love, in the sanctity of loyalty, and in the quiet, comforting rhythm of a life that was steady and predictable. I thought that was all I needed. Please share your thoughts in the comment section below. Each of your shares is not only a motivation for us but also contributes to spreading value to the community. If you find this content useful, don't forget to watch the whole video, like, subscribe, and share with someone you think needs to hear this too. For 12 years, my marriage to Daniel was the epitome of stability. We were that couple everyone admired from a distance. The dependable ones, the ones who seemed to have it all together. We weren't flashy, we weren't dramatic. We were simply solid, grounded, ordinary in the best sense of the word. But as time passed, I began to realize that sometimes, ordinary isn't enough to keep two people together, no matter how deeply they care for each other. That was a painful lesson I had to learn the hard way. Daniel and I met in college, in that world of youth and possibility, where anything seemed possible. He was the quintessential good guy, steady, thoughtful, a bit reserved, not the life of the party but the kind of person you could count on without question. He never had that magnetic presence that made heads turn when he entered a room, but there was something about him, something quietly magnetic, that drew me in. He was like a lighthouse in the dark, a calm beacon in the midst of chaos. I fell for him so completely, so deeply. It was a love that felt like home, safe and familiar, but in a way I didn't realize until much later. It was also a love that lacked the fire I hadn't known I needed. And that, I suppose, is where the trouble began. While so many of my friends were swept up in relationships with athletes, with ambitious dreamers chasing the bright lights of success, I found myself drawn to someone entirely different. I chose Daniel, the quiet, steady presence who knew how I liked my coffee without me ever needing to say a word, the man who would walk me back to my dorm after the long, grueling nights of study sessions, his hand warm and reassuring in mine. There was something about his simplicity, his ability to be present without needing to prove anything, that grounded me in a way I hadn't known I needed. A year after graduation, we married. The life we began together unfolded at a rapid pace. Careers, a mortgage, 2 kids who brought their own unique kind of chaos into our lives, and a loyal dog named Cooper who followed us everywhere. From the outside, our life looked picture-perfect, like a frame from a storybook. But beneath the surface, it was quieter, settled into the comfortable rhythms of routine. Felt safe, predictable, just the way I thought life was meant to be. I wanted to believe that comfort was enough, that it was all I needed to feel fulfilled. But somewhere deep down I felt something stirring, something I couldn't quite name. It started so subtly, like the faintest crack in a window you don't notice at first, but over time, you begin to feel the chill creeping in, nipping at your skin when you least expect it. It wasn't one big event, no moment that could be pinpointed as the cause. Daniel didn't become someone unrecognizable, someone cruel or distant. He was still the man I had married, the one who was kind, responsible, and so wonderfully gentle with our children. But somewhere along the way, we stopped truly seeing each other. He would come home after long, exhausting days at work, his mind clearly somewhere else, his body there but his thoughts distant. And I fell into a rhythm, doing the laundry, preparing meals, handling the never-ending stream of school pickups, dishes, and bedtime routines. The days blurred together into a cycle of routine that left little room for the small moments of connection we once had. I kept telling myself, this is just a season, a temporary lull. We'll find our way back. But even as I clung to that hope, a quiet fear began to settle in. What if we didn't? What if the cracks kept spreading? widening just enough to pull us apart. But weeks bled into months, and months melted into years, each day heavier than the last. I tried to reach him. There were nights when I would approach the subject, hesitant but determined. I'd speak softly, almost apologetically, as if the words themselves might shatter something fragile between us. "Do you ever feel like we're just roommates?" I'd ask, my voice tinged with the fear that maybe I already knew the answer. He'd offer me a weary smile, one that never quite reached his eyes, and say in that low, soothing tone that had once been comforting, "It's just been a long week, babe. We'll plan something fun soon." The soon was always an empty promise, a hollow echo that drifted away before it could ever take shape. And yet I clung to it, just as I clung to him, hoping that somehow, someday it would be different. But life, relentless and uncaring, kept moving forward, and we kept drifting apart like two ships lost at sea, too far apart to even see the other anymore. Then came the book club, an unexpected suggestion from my friend Marissa. She could see how much I was withering, how the weight of everything was sinking me. "You need something for you, something outside the house, outside this routine," she said, her voice full of concern that I couldn't quite ignore. So I joined. Thursday nights became my escape, a fragile lifeline. Once a month, a small group of women, and for reasons I couldn't explain, one man, would gather at a local bookstore cafe. We'd talk about books, sip wine, and bit by bit peel back layers of ourselves. There was something cathartic about it, something freeing in those conversations. They weren't just about novels. They were about us, our lives, our struggles. That's where I met Jack. He wasn't like the others. He was older, probably in his mid-40s, and his presence in a group of mostly women was unusual, even odd. Yet there was something magnetic about him, something quiet and thoughtful that set him apart. Jack was divorced, carrying the weight of his own unspoken stories. He didn't talk much, but when he did, his words had substance. He didn't dominate the conversation, didn't try to steer it. Instead, he listened, really listened, in a way that made you feel seen, as though your thoughts mattered. His observations were always so deliberate, so measured, whether they were about the books we read or about life itself. He didn't flirt, not in any obvious way, yet his gaze, his eyes, had a way of holding you, making you feel as though you were the only person in the room, as if you weren't just another voice, but an individual. At first, I told myself it meant nothing. It was just a conversation, just a fleeting moment of connection in the sea of people I'd lost touch with. It was nice, I'd think, to have someone genuinely hear me. But I didn't allow myself to dwell on it. I couldn't afford to. Or at least that's what I convinced myself. Then, one night, after an impassioned debate about a character's choices in a novel, I found myself staying behind, lingering long after the others had left. The cafe had emptied, the chatter fading into silence, and it was just Jack and me. But the conversation had shifted. It wasn't about the book anymore. It was about life, about the cracks in a marriage that no one sees until they're too wide to ignore. It was about feeling like you were disappearing, losing yourself in the routine of everyday existence. He didn't press me for details. He didn't make me share anything I wasn't ready to. He just listened, really listened, with a kind of quiet empathy that felt almost sacred, like he understood without needing to say a word. In that moment, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit before. Jack wasn't just a man in the book club. He was something more. Something I hadn't known I was missing until I'd found it again. That subtle, quiet exchange after each book club meeting became a pattern, an unspoken ritual that I couldn't ignore, though I tried. Every time the conversations would end, but I'd linger just a little longer, standing there, talking to Jack about things that, at first, felt innocent. There was nothing inappropriate, nothing suggestive, but there was an undercurrent, a subtle tension I couldn't quite name. It felt as though something was unfolding beneath the surface, like a seed buried deep in the soil, fragile yet determined, slowly reaching upward, stretching toward the warmth of the sun. I wasn't sure if I was imagining it, but every word he spoke seemed to echo with an understanding I hadn't known I needed, and with each passing conversation, it was as though something in me began to awaken, quietly, tentatively, and with a deep yearning I could no longer silence. I never mentioned Jack to Daniel. Not because anything had happened between us, because nothing had, but because I could already anticipate the confusion in his eyes, the questions he wouldn't ask, and the answers I couldn't give. How could I explain the quiet pull I felt? How could I tell him that I was starting to think about Jack between those Thursday nights? That the meetings, the conversations, the moments of connection had become the only time in my life I felt seen? How could I explain that what I was missing wasn't just the books or the wine, but the feeling of being truly heard, truly present with someone who understood the quiet ache of invisibility? It wasn't something I could voice. It was too complicated, too tangled in emotions I was afraid to confront. So, I kept it to myself, pretending that it meant nothing, all the while knowing it meant everything. Then came that Thursday. It was raining, no, not just raining. It was a full-blown storm, a downpour that seemed to wash away everything in its path, leaving the world outside a blur of wet streets and swirling winds. I hadn't planned on staying late, but the storm was so relentless, the air so thick with the sound of thunder, that I had no choice but to accept Jack's offer for a ride home. My car was parked across the street, and I hadn't thought to bring an umbrella. The offer felt innocent enough, just two people caught in the storm, offering each other shelter. But when I slid into the passenger seat of his car, I was struck by how different it felt from any ride I had ever shared with Daniel. It wasn't just the storm outside. It was the quiet. There was no chatter, no clattering of things in the backseat, no traces of a life being lived in constant motion. No snack wrappers, no half-drunk coffee cups, no toys scattered across the floorboards. It was an empty space, a silent space, a space that felt untethered. He asked me, "Do you ever miss quiet?" His voice was calm, like the stillness inside the car, and it caught me off guard. I wasn't sure how to answer at first, because I'd never considered that question. But when I did, the words tumbled out before I could stop them. I miss being. The moment I spoke those words, I felt something shift, something I hadn't been ready for but couldn't undo. That was the first time I realized that the line between friendship and something else was no longer clear. The car ride was only 7 minutes long, but in those 7 minutes, I felt the weight of everything I'd been avoiding. I felt seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. When I got home, the silence was deafening. Daniel was asleep on the couch, his body slumped in front of the television, the flickering glow of the screen casting strange shadows across the room. The remote was loosely held in his hand, as though it had dropped there without care. I stood there, frozen, watching him, a strange emptiness settling in my chest. I wondered for the first time when we had stopped sharing real moments. When had we become strangers who merely occupied the same space? And I wondered, with a strange ache in my heart, if he would have even noticed if I hadn't come home at all. The thought hit me like a cold wave, a sudden realization that maybe, just maybe, I wasn't the only one drifting. I swore to myself that I wouldn't let it happen again. I promised myself that I'd shut the door, that I wouldn't let myself fall into that same pattern of weakness. It was nothing, I told myself, just a fleeting moment, nothing more. But 2 weeks later, I found myself standing there, at the crossroads of my own promises, and I couldn't turn away. This time there was no rain. There were no heavy clouds or thundering skies to mask the weight of what was happening. This time I made the choice. I let him drive me. As we drove, the conversation shifted in ways I hadn't expected, became deeper, more intimate. And though nothing physical had happened, there was an undeniable shift in the emotional landscape between us. Jack's presence was consuming in a way I hadn't anticipated. It wasn't just his voice or his eyes. It was the way he saw through the carefully constructed wall I'd built around my heart. That wall had been my fortress, my shield, and yet, with every word, with every question, Jack dismantled it piece by piece. He asked things Daniel hadn't even bothered to ask in years. Questions that cut straight to the heart of who I was. "What makes you happy?" he'd asked softly, as if the answer mattered to him in ways I hadn't yet understood. "What do you need that you're not getting?" His words lingered in the air, heavy with empathy. And then, with a quiet intensity, he'd asked, "Who were you before all of this?" And in that moment, I realized I didn't even remember who I was before the walls, before the life that had turned into something I didn't recognize. Jack was different. He noticed the smallest things about me, things that went unnoticed by everyone else. He remembered the little details, when I mentioned my favorite book in passing, or how my eyes softened when I spoke about a memory from my childhood. He noticed when I wore my hair in a new style, or when my laugh sounded just a bit too forced. He saw the way I lingered a little too long on a sunset outside the cafe window, as if I was searching for something I couldn't name. And with each passing day, I began to hide things from Daniel. Small things, almost imperceptible at first. When he asked how book club went, I'd give him a quick, evasive answer, a half-hearted smile. I didn't mention Jack. I didn't want him to ask more, because I knew I wouldn't be able to explain it. I started keeping my phone out of sight, not because there were messages, there weren't any, but because I was afraid of what would happen if I let myself get too used to hearing from Jack. The guilt was suffocating. It wasn't a guilt born from anything physical, from anything that could be plainly called wrong. No, it was a much quieter, insidious guilt that ate away at me slowly, with each passing day. Nothing had happened, at least nothing I could point to and say, "This is where I went astray." But I could feel the wrongness creeping in, growing like a dark cloud in the pit of my stomach. It was a strange kind of guilt, the kind that rises when you're torn between what you know is right and what you desperately crave. I hated the secrecy, the lies, the weight of pretending that nothing was changing. And yet, there was this overwhelming, almost desperate need for the connection I found in Jack's presence. It was like I was standing on the edge of a cliff, not knowing whether to fall or turn away, and neither option felt like it could save me. I was split in two, torn between the life I knew and the person I was starting to become. And neither side, it seemed, was winning. I'll never forget the night everything changed. It was a Thursday, as if fate had marked it on the calendar. We had gathered once again like we always did, to discuss a novel, a story about betrayal of all things. The irony wasn't lost on me. As the others trickled out of the room, leaving us behind once more, I felt the weight of the moment. And then he did it. Jack looked at me, really looked at me, as if he could see past the walls I'd so carefully constructed around my heart. His gaze was intense, searching, like he was reaching for something deep inside me that I wasn't ready to reveal. And then, as if he had finally found what he was looking for, he spoke. "You don't have to keep pretending you're okay." I froze, my chest tightening with a mixture of fear and relief. His words felt like a mirror being held up to me, showing me everything I had tried to hide. For a moment I couldn't breathe. I felt the weight of his observation pressing down on me, and the truth was too raw to ignore. I think I held my breath for what felt like a full minute before I finally whispered, almost too softly for him to hear, "I'm so tired, Jack. I don't even recognize myself anymore." My voice cracked, betraying the exhaustion I had kept hidden for so long. And in that moment, everything I had been running from, everything I had tried to bury, came rushing to the surface, and I didn't know how to stop it. Then, just like that, he reached out to me. There were no words, no promises, just the soft, steady pressure of his hand in mine. It was so simple, so brief, but it felt like an electric jolt, something far more significant than any physical touch. It was a quiet understanding, a moment of unspoken solidarity that went straight to the heart of everything I had been avoiding. In that instant, I felt as though a door had opened inside me, one I wasn't sure I had the strength to close again. It was a small gesture, but it felt seismic, like the world shifting beneath me. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? I lay awake in our guest bedroom, staring up at the ceiling, my thoughts a tangled mess of guilt, confusion, and an ache I couldn't explain. I tried to make sense of it all, to understand what had happened to me, to us. I loved my husband, or at least I loved the man I had married, the man I had once believed would be my everything. But somewhere along the way, in the chaos of life and responsibility, I had lost myself. I had become a shadow of the woman I used to be, and I didn't know how to find my way back. Life had become a whirlwind of noise and distraction, and somewhere in that storm we had lost each other. The connection we once had was a distant memory now, buried beneath the weight of everyday life. In that empty space, in that aching silence, someone else had stepped in, someone who seemed to understand me in a way that no one else did. And though I wasn't proud of what I was feeling, I couldn't deny it anymore. I wasn't trying to justify it, I couldn't. But I was falling for someone who wasn't my husband. The realization hit me like a tidal wave, and I was caught in the undertow. I didn't know what to do next. I didn't know how to stop what had already started. I can't even count the number of times I've thought about telling Daniel what was happening inside me. Not because I wanted to hurt him. No, that wasn't it at all. And not because I had some grand confession to make. It was more like a silent, aching cry for attention, a desperate yearning for him to see me again. I wanted him to look up from the endless sea of emails, from the static blur of the evening news, and really notice that I was slowly unraveling right in front of him. That I was breaking in ways that words couldn't seem to express. But every time something held me back. The timing never seemed right. There was always something else. Another school project for the kids, another grocery list to create, another work trip for him to prepare for, or the ever-growing list of tiny household repairs. Life, with all its relentless mundane tasks, didn't stop for emotional chaos. It didn't care that I was slowly losing pieces of myself. And every time I tried to inch toward the truth, to drop a hint or two, it was like he couldn't see beyond the surface. He'd look at me, see the weariness in my eyes, the tightness in my chest, and somehow interpret it all as stress, as if I was just running on empty from the weight of the day-to-day. And his response, though well-meaning, felt like a band-aid on a wound that needed stitches. "You need a day off," he'd suggest, or, "Why don't I take the kids this weekend, and you can go out with Marissa?" It wasn't that I didn't appreciate his attempts. I did. But it felt like he was trying to fix a broken heart with practical solutions, like trying to put out a fire with a glass of water. He was missing the point, missing me in all of it. Meanwhile, Jack was slowly but surely becoming more than just a fleeting presence in my Thursdays. His messages were becoming more frequent, more intimate, though nothing overtly crossing a line. A quote from the book we were reading together. A question about something I'd said, or my opinion on something that was more personal than professional. And those little texts, they did something to me. They made me feel again, feel alive. I found myself anticipating his name on my screen, my heart giving a little flutter every time it appeared, even though I quickly tucked the phone away, ashamed, like a teenager sneaking notes in class. But I couldn't help it. His words lit something inside me, something I had forgotten how to recognize in the midst of all the clutter of my life. One quiet afternoon, after I dropped the kids off at a lively birthday party, I found myself driving aimlessly, my mind heavy with thoughts. I parked a few blocks away, not quite ready to return home. The house awaited me like a relentless reminder of all the things I couldn't face. The kitchen counters piled high with dirty dishes, the laundry basket spilling over with clothes that never seemed to get folded, the vacuum lines in the carpet, a hollow illusion of order that Daniel insisted meant everything was fine. I sat there, the weight of it all pressing down on me, staring at the dull, lifeless dashboard in front of me. There was an emptiness I couldn't escape, a heaviness in my chest that felt too much for me to bear. I didn't want to go back to that chaos. I didn't want to be alone in it. And, without giving it a second thought, I reached for my phone and dialed Jack's number. The phone rang only once before he picked up. "Hey," I whispered, my voice betraying the tightness in my throat. It cracked, a shaky sound I didn't even try to hide. "Are you free?" A brief, pregnant silence followed, stretching out longer than it should have. Then his voice broke through, warm and calm. "Yeah," he replied, a hint of concern lacing his words. "You okay?" I nodded, even though he couldn't see me, my eyes fixed on the steering wheel, as though it could somehow offer me an answer. "I don't know," I murmured, my words barely audible, thick with the weight of my emotions. "I just didn't want to be alone right now." Without hesitation, he invited me to come by. His place was a small, unassuming apartment above a flower shop in the heart of downtown. There was nothing particularly extraordinary about it. No grand gestures or sweeping romanticism, but in its simplicity, There was a quiet kind of peace that I craved. I didn't even go inside, though. Instead, we sat on a weathered bench near the entrance, the cold nipping at my skin, but I barely noticed. I was too wrapped up in the comfort of his presence. The way he didn't ask, didn't push, just allowed me to be. The world around us moved in a blur, people passing by without a care, and we drank our coffee in companionable silence. It was as though time had slowed down, and for a brief moment, I didn't have to carry the burden of everything I had been running from. We talked, but not about anything that mattered, at least not directly. It was small talk, the kind of conversation that served as a bridge, a way to fill the space between two people without having to confront the truth. But in his quiet way, Jack made room for me, for the parts of me that were too messy, too complicated to show anyone else. I remember asking him once, in a fit of curiosity, why he kept coming to the book club, surrounded by women who often overshadowed him with their voices and opinions. He had smiled, that gentle, knowing smile that always made me feel like he could see through the walls I had built around myself. Because every once in a while, he said, his voice steady, someone says something real. And I think that's rare. It was then that I understood, or at least I thought I did. He wasn't just talking about the book club. He was talking about me. And the realization settled in, a heavy, trembling truth that I didn't know how to handle. The thought of it terrified me. That night, I went home and climbed into bed beside Daniel, the familiar weight of his body next to mine a stark contrast to the turbulent emotions swirling inside me. The room was still and quiet, save for the sound of his soft, rhythmic breathing, the only thing that had ever seemed constant in my life. I lay there, staring up at the ceiling as I had the week before, tracing the familiar cracks in the paint with my eyes. His breathing was steady, but there were moments when his leg twitched, or he let out a sigh as he rolled over, the sounds so ingrained in my mind that they were like a soundtrack to a life that felt like it was slipping through my fingers. I thought about everything this bed had seen. The weight of history pressed down on me in those moments. 2 children born from love, a miscarriage that had shattered a part of me I hadn't known existed, the sharp edges of countless arguments that lingered in the air like unresolved tension, and the fragile moments of peace when we apologized, when we whispered our hopes and dreams beneath the covers, hoping no one would hear. I wondered if those dreams had died long ago, suffocated by the years, by the little things we never said, by the things that went unsaid, that piled up in the silence. And yet, in that stillness, under the same roof that once held so much warmth, I felt like I was lying next to a stranger. The irony of it hit me in waves. The way loneliness could creep up on you in the presence of someone you once knew so intimately. There was a hollow emptiness beside me, a distance that no physical closeness could bridge. It was as if we were miles apart, living parallel lives that no longer intertwined, just waiting for something to change. I didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know if it could be fixed. But what I did know was that the guilt gnawed at me in new, sharper ways. The weight of it crushed me. I began to pull away from Jack, as though creating distance between us would somehow ease the ache I felt deep inside. His texts went unanswered, or worse, I offered vague, half-hearted replies, hoping that would be enough to silence the yearning that had begun to bloom between us. After book club, I found myself making excuses, telling him I needed to get home early, leaving without lingering, as though leaving quickly could erase the unspoken connection that had started to form between us. I told myself that if I just shut it down before it became something more, something dangerous, maybe I could put everything back together with Daniel. Maybe I just needed to refocus, to remember what we had. But deep down I knew better. Life wasn't that neat. It wasn't that simple. Of course Jack noticed. He wasn't blind. He wasn't stupid. He saw the distance growing between us, the way I became more and more withdrawn, more distant in my words and actions. And so, one night after book club when the rest of the group had dispersed, he caught up with me in the parking lot. He stood there for a moment, watching me with an intensity one couldn't escape, the night air thick with the weight of his unspoken questions. Did I do something wrong? His voice was soft, gentle, like he was afraid of the answer, afraid of pushing too hard. I shook my head, my throat tight. No, I said, though I knew I was lying. It's not you. It's just everything. The words felt empty, hollow, and I hated how they fell from my lips, but they were the only ones I could find. He didn't push me, didn't demand more. Instead, he stood there, his hands tucked into his pockets, as if weighing something heavy in his heart. After a long moment of silence, he spoke again, his voice quieter, more vulnerable this time. "I care about you," he said, and the sincerity in his words made my chest tighten. "But I don't want to make your life harder. If walking away is what you need, I'll respect that." In those few words, something inside me shifted, something fragile and aching. I wanted to tell him that I didn't want him to walk away, that I didn't want to lose him, but I couldn't find the courage to say it. The truth hung between us like a tightrope, and I was terrified of what would happen if I took a single step. I didn't answer him right away. I didn't know what to say. So I just nodded, as if that simple gesture could somehow shield me from the truth swirling inside me. Then, without another word, I climbed into my car and started the engine. But as I drove, the floodgates opened. The tears came so suddenly, so violently, that I could barely see through the windshield. Each tear was heavy with regret, with confusion, with a sorrow I couldn't quite place. For all his flaws, God, I knew there were many, I couldn't deny that Jack had seen me, really seen me. And in that moment, I realized that I had let him in. I had crossed a line, even if I told myself over and over that I hadn't. I had betrayed something sacred, even if I wasn't entirely sure what that was yet. The weight of it crushed me, and I could hardly breathe, my chest tightening with the unbearable knowledge that I was no longer the person I had once believed myself to be. When I finally made it home, everything felt unsettlingly still. The house, which normally hummed with the noise of family life, felt empty, like the silence had seeped into every corner. Daniel was working late again, his absence a reminder of everything that had been slipping through our fingers. The kids were already asleep, their innocent faces soft with dreams I couldn't share. I stood in the kitchen, my gaze fixed on the fridge, cluttered with school magnets, grocery lists, and coupons I kept meaning to use but never did. Each magnet, each piece of paper, felt like a small, cruel reminder of how far I had drifted from the person I used to be. What was I even doing? Was this really my life? And if it was it enough? The next day, I found myself asking Daniel if we could get away for the weekend. Just the two of us. It wasn't something I'd planned to say, but the words tumbled out before I could stop them. He looked at me, surprised, his brows furrowing as he tried to make sense of my request. But after a beat, he agreed. It was too quick, too easy, like he was desperate to please me without asking why. I called my mom to arrange for help with the kids, and though she raised an eyebrow, questioning but not pressing, I could sense her silent judgment. It didn't matter. I needed to get away, to be somewhere far from the life that had become so suffocating. We drove to a cabin in the mountains, somewhere rustic and untouched by the noise of the world. No TV, limited cell service, just the raw, unfiltered presence of each other. The first night was painfully awkward. We sat across from each other, unsure of how to bridge the gulf that had grown between us. Without the routine of daily life to hide behind, we were forced to face the silence. The familiar walls of our conversations felt like strangers. But then, one evening, as the fire crackled softly between us, I couldn't keep it inside anymore. The weight of everything I had been feeling for months spilled out in the softest whisper. "I don't know if we're happy anymore," I said, the words trembling in the quiet room, as fragile as glass. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stared into the fire, his face shadowed with something I couldn't quite name. After what felt like an eternity, he spoke, his voice quiet but full of a pain that matched mine. "I've been afraid to ask that same question," he admitted. And that was it. That was the moment we started to really talk. We talked about the distance between us, the way we had become like strangers sharing a roof, the deafening silence that had settled in our relationship. He opened up about the pressure he'd been under at work, the crushing fear of losing his job that had consumed him for months. He had been trying so hard to hold everything together that he hadn't realized how much he had pushed me away. how much we had both been drifting. I poured out the loneliness I had been carrying for far too long. I didn't say Jack's name. Not then, not in that moment. The shame still clung to the edges of my words, too heavy to let them escape fully. But I couldn't hold back the truth any longer. I confessed how I'd been searching for something to fill the emptiness inside me, seeking connection in places I never should have. I had let someone else slip into the space that had been ours to share, a space we'd both neglected for too long, too afraid to face what was missing. As the words tumbled out, I braced for the anger, the accusations, the distance. But he didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm out in rage. He just sat there, his eyes red-rimmed and full of a quiet pain that mirrored my own. His silence wasn't the coldness I feared. It was the weight of understanding. Slowly, deliberately, he nodded, absorbing everything I'd confessed. And then, with a rawness that shook me to my core, he spoke. His voice barely above a whisper. "We can fix this." I wanted to believe him more than anything. And deep down I knew I did. If we both wanted to, we could find a way back. I wanted that, I really did. That weekend didn't erase the scars we'd both been hiding, but it cracked the door open just a little, enough to let a sliver of light through. We began to rebuild, piece by fragile piece. We started having coffee together every morning, just 10 minutes before the world rushed in with its demands. Those 10 minutes became sacred, a small but steady moment of connection in the chaos. Slowly, we began sharing more. Memories, music, little inside jokes, laughter that felt foreign at first but soon became familiar again. It wasn't perfect, not by any stretch, and sometimes in the quietest moments, I would catch myself thinking of Jack. The ghost of him would slip into my mind, but I made a choice every time. I would not see him again. I even stepped away from book club, telling Marissa I needed a break. She didn't ask why, and I was grateful for that. Maybe she suspected something, maybe she didn't, but she respected my space without pushing, and that gave me a kind of peace I didn't even know I needed. Daniel and I started therapy, not because something catastrophic had happened, but because we both realized we had been coasting for far too long, letting the distance between us widen until it felt like an insurmountable gap. If we were going to find our way back to each other, we needed help, and we both knew it. The sessions were hard. There were times when I questioned if it was too late, if we'd lost each other beyond repair. But there were also moments, small, fleeting but precious, when we rediscovered each other in ways I hadn't thought possible. We laughed. We cried. We held on. One night, as we washed dishes side by side in the quiet of our kitchen, Daniel looked at me with a softness that felt almost like the beginning of something new. "You look lighter lately," he said. His voice filled with a tenderness that made my heart ache. And for the first time in a long time I felt the truth in his words. I felt lighter. And I realized I felt lighter. Not because everything was perfect, but because I had stopped pretending. I had started choosing honesty, even when it was painful. Jack faded into the background. He never reached out again. I don't know what he thinks of me now. Maybe he thinks I used him. Maybe he understands. Maybe he let go too. But what I do know is that I learned something important. Affairs don't always start with desire. Sometimes they start with silence, with long stretches of emotional neglect, with feeling invisible. But healing starts with truth, with choosing to turn toward instead of away, with deciding that the love you built is still worth the work it takes to save it. And for me it was. It's been almost a year since all of that happened, and I still think about it more often than I probably should. Not because I miss it or because I wish things had turned out differently, but because it changed me. It forced me to face parts of myself I had ignored for too long. My loneliness, my resentment, my need to be seen. Not just as a wife or mother, but as a person with her own heart. Daniel and I are in a better place now. Not perfect, but better. We've rebuilt slowly and honestly. There are still days when we slip into old habits. When the silence creeps in, but we recognize it now. Talk more. We listen more. Check in. Some wounds don't disappear completely, but they fade and they teach. I never told Daniel the full truth about Jack. Maybe one day I will, if it ever feels necessary. But for now, I've made peace with what happened. not because it was right but because it was real and it woke me up. And sometimes, waking up is the first step toward finding your way home again. Thank you for staying with us. If you find it interesting and useful, please subscribe, like and share so you don't miss the next video. Thanks.